Good morning, everyone. I'd like to introduce you to architect Astrid Huwald, who is a lecturer down at Swinburne University in Melbourne. And I've asked Astrid to speak with us both last year and this year, as she's a particular expert on CEPTD principles. You all know a hell of a lot more about the Newcastle port site than Astrid does. Astrid doesn't know too much about it, but she knows a little bit about it. So I will be very interested how we can all use this insight and lecture into discussing the port going forward in future weeks. So welcome, Astrid.
Oh, hello, Patrick. Have you got my happy face up? Yes.
I have. I've got your happy face up. And I'll share my screen in a minute.
Okay. Fantastic. So Patrick's briefed me a little bit about your site. And so what I've done is pull out from CEPTD principles, which I'll explain what they are, what I think is relevant to your site. And of course, I teach architects and interior architects. So when I'm talking, there's a bias towards hard landscaping and the built environment. But of course, when I'm talking about spatial concepts and enclosing spaces, you know, whether it's hard landscaping or actual vegetation, the principles still apply, just so that you know my biases. But Patrick, let's
Lovely. Okay, I'll do a bit of share screen, shall I?
Share screening.
And I'll pop it here.
Okay, fabulous. Patrick's guiding me through.
Hang on, I'm just going to make sure I've got that audio on. Okay, we are good. So, Astrid, now this is going to be interesting. Hopefully you can see this, can't you, Astrid?
Of course I can. Of course I can.
Lovely. I'll hand it over to you. Okay.
So I teach to interior architects about environmental psychology-based subjects, and I'm going to talk to you about something called CEPTD, which is an acronym that stands for Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. And it started off with law enforcement agencies and designers working together, looking at how to prevent crime. So that's designing in the negative. But now actually, and probably the next slide, Patrick.
Yeah.
How you prevent crime is that you design spaces that people feel comfortable to inhabit. Because if we feel comfortable to inhabit and express ourselves, in the civic realm, that this positive occupation actually bars negative, the negative. So really, although CEPTD sounds like you're designing to prevent crime, really what it's about is what are the attributes of spaces that attract us? How do we, at a deep psychological level, put elements in spaces so that they speak to us and that we feel safe in them? And safety for a designer maybe seems like an odd place to start, but and here is Abraham Maslow's triangle of actualization, and this is like Psychology 101. And at the very bottom, after you've sheltered people and you've fed them, the next one up is safety. And what Maslow, with this triangle, what Maslow is talking about is that you've got to have the bottom of the triangle sorted before you can step up the triangle. So you have to feel physically safe, and then the next one is psychological safety. And interestingly, all of the higher levels, belonging and love, self-esteem, intellectual pursuits, all of that doesn't actually happen until you feel safe. So safety is this really basic precondition before things like apprehension of beauty or, does this space look nice? You've got to feel safe and grounded in yourself before any of that even takes place. And it's a neat body of knowledge to know, just particularly post-COVID, because we've been disconnected from others, we've been disconnected from the public realm, and so it's a neat time to come in and apply these principles. Next slide, Patrick. So CEPTD has a number of theorists, and I'll sort of talk about the first three. And what you'll notice that they're from the 1960s and the 70s largely. And the CEPTD theory, being based in the 60s and the 70s, was actually railing against that what was before, meaning that they were critiquing modernist principles, and modernist town planning principles in particular. Next slide, Patrick. And in particular, CEPTD people were interested in why and we've got on the left, we've got under the thing of scale, very inappropriate scaled environments. You know, you'd feel like a cockroach running around here. And, you know, this is modernist functional town planning, you know, that we've all inherited today, where you've got functional zoning, the separation of offices over here, residences over here, industry over here, very sterile, and a scale that is dominated by the car, but not pedestrians. And on the right, this comes from Jan Gehl's Cities from People. And the above image is Venice, which he calls a city that's apprehended at 5 kilometres an hour at walking pace. And then below is Dubai, which is a car-dominated. No one walks in Dubai. And you can tell that it's the scale of the buildings and the composition. It's for a car. It's designed to be read at 100 kilometres an hour. Next slide, Patrick. And from what Patrick's told me is that with your site, you've actually got residential areas that are pre-industrial, Victorian brick, beautiful, beautiful single-storey, low-rise brick residential areas, which speak to a pre-industrial city scale, which alludes to this slower walking scale, because when they were conceived of, there was horses and carts. And then you've got these working areas of Newcastle that are this modernist scale. And quite clearly, whatever strategy, you're going to have quite different strategies depending on the context that you're actually working on. And a lot of this CEPTD theory is trying to bring back the positive aspects of the pre-industrial city, quite specifically creating a scale that speaks to the human scale, encouraging foot traffic and, you know, combating the dominance of the car. So it's about scale. It's and also this idea of the mixed use of space as well, rather than that you've got a monoculture of here is residential, here is industrial, and never the twain shall meet. Creating a much more rich street life by negotiating and overlapping of uses. Next slide, Patrick. So I'm just going to tell you a few of the main ideas of CEPTD, not in order of importance. I'm actually going to go from the simplest to the more complex, just to sort of step it up. So with CEPTD theory, over the past few decades, people have worked out, largely through observation, the attributes of spaces that people feel safe in. That's put in the most simple way. And the first one, which we call this theory of maintenance, comes from, it's called the broken windows theory, from James Wilson and George Kelling in the 80s. And the idea is that if a window is broken, soon all the other windows will be broken, meaning, next slide, that what you've got to do is visually, either through maintenance or as a designer by the materials that you choose, communicate care. Because it's something quite deep and psychological. If you see that there's rubbish everywhere, if you see that there's a park and nothing's neat, if rubbish lies around, if there's graffiti, subconsciously we think, well, they don't care, why should I? And it's quite a deep subconscious thing within us. So it's not only maintenance regimes, but as a designer, directly you're responsible for choosing a visual language of care. And this will depend on your context, because in your residential areas, which are old brick, you know, you might continue with that. Whereas in those portside areas, very different visual language. Care might be something about efficiency. You know, you will have to position yourself and think what communicates basically civic pride, what palette of materials, what planting palette. I think the next slide continues on in the same vein. Oh, no, it's, so yeah, no, back to that one. So yes, decide what palette communicates care. And normally that means hard-wearing, timeless, and of its locale, you know, using local stone, what looks like it belongs there, okay? Then the next concept is surveillance. And we human beings, partially there's a dominance in the use of the eye over the other senses because we can see what's happening and we rely on the eye for safety before we smell trouble or feel trouble or hear trouble. You know, you can see something in the difference. So surveillance is partially about the dominance of the eye, and human beings feel, this is CEPTD speak, feel comfortable in the co-presence of others. We feel comfortable when there are other human beings around us, but we need to see them. So in this weirdo plan, so surveillance happens in plan and section. So in plan, if you walked into this space, you'd feel very uncomfortable because what is around the corner? You might have other human beings there, but they might have malicious intent. People normally don't, but psychologically, we like to have a clear view. So you would never design anything like this space that I've shown here. This is the opposite of what we want because there might be other human beings there, but we can't see them. We need to see them clearly to feel comfortable. So surveillance happens in plan and it also happens in section. And in section, next slide, Patrick, this is particularly what is of concern for you in landscape. What we say in CEPTDD is that you've got to remove the middle ground. So that's all vegetation, all hard landscaping, not all, but to minimise. So yes, you might have columns supporting a canopy, but you minimise them. Wherever you can, you're working with an articulated ground plane and an articulated canopy. And the reason is that between 450 and about 2400, that's about what the human eye needs to actually see through. So you've got to keep the lines of sight open across your site. And so you might come to a site and you'll identify where are those lines of sight broken and you might propose a remedy. Now, as an interesting aside, next slide, surveillance is a concept that cuts across cultures, and to illustrate that, and this is a small story, but I think an interesting story, particularly for the field of landscape architecture, is that when, and it's outlined in this fantastic book, The Biggest Estate on Earth by Bill Gamage. I might go to the next slide before I come back to this one. Patrick, just go to the next one. What Bill Gamage did is piece together from colonial paintings, sketches and colonial accounts from explorers and settlers, Australia as it was actually encountered and as it was created by Indigenous peoples. And it was actually a vastly cleared land. And very, very interestingly, if you see, and this is all the states, I've done Melbourne because I'm from Victoria. On the left, we've got Robert Hoddle's view of Melbourne in 1847. From all accounts, from Joseph Banks, is this account that what they saw, the Australia that they saw and the landscape that they encountered resembled a nobleman's park or a gentleman's park. And what they're talking about is because all of the ruling classes who settled Australia, maybe not the convicts, you know, they were very cultural people. And in the 18th century, the English garden was a very influential idea across the continent. And if you look at both pictures, one from England, so that's a quintessential English garden, and the other is all sorts of illustrations of early Australia, you'll see that the land was quite cleared. So it's exactly, you know, you've got an articulated, you've got a ground plane, you've got a canopy, but you've got what we call a very clear figure-ground relationship. You can actually survey the landscape. Now, in CEPTD, we know this is comfortable, and it's interesting that this clear figure-ground relationship is one that our First Peoples created, and it's one that the English garden preferences. Two very different cultures, and yet two very similar ways of, and both are constructs, and it was a cultural blindness that stopped Captain Cook and Banks actually considering that the First Peoples had actually created it. They thought Australia made itself like that, but it was created through cultural practices of burning or fire stick farming, as it has been called. So what do we do with this information? I can present it to you that it's a preference. We like to see through landscapes. We feel comfortable when our vision isn't blocked. They're both landscapes of control, but and when I say control, it's visual control. To survey is to understand, is to control. Of course, the English garden is human-centric. It's just about humans and what's good for humans, whereas, of course, our First Peoples designs are interspecies designs. When we look after nature, nature looks after us. And the purpose of the clearing was to create hunting grounds. And it was all about burning so that there would be grass for grazing animals, cleared spaces so that you could see them. And it was all about creating ideal conditions for all species. So whilst they're landscapes of control to different ends. And I think it's really important to read Bill Gamage's book because it touches on what is natural. You know, when you're talking in your schemes, when you're possibly reinstating something, what are you reinstating? Because maybe if we go back to the first slide just before, and here we've got Eugene von Gerard's Mount Eccles, I think is somewhere near in the Western District in Victoria. That's as he saw it, and you can see that there's a patchwork of cleared areas, forested areas, that they're like wildlife corridors. And if we look at Mount Eccles today in 2007, what we think is natural bush may actually not be natural. So it touches on this idea of what is natural. So if you're reinstating natural vegetation, what are you doing? Are you reinstating what we think it is today, which is this messy understory? Is that what it is? Are you reinstating First Peoples landscapes, as shown in Eugene von Gerard, or is it something from pre-First Peoples 60,000 years ago? And I think as a landscape architect, you've got to have a position actually on that. So there we go. My plug for please do look at Bill Gamage's book. So that's an aside on the importance of surveillance, that we feel very comfortable in landscapes where the middle ground has been taken out. Okay, Patrick, we'll go a couple of slides, okay? And while I'm talking about surveillance, we also like to see where we're headed. And in CEPTD speak, we call that wayfinding, that you design a journey. So not only do people want clear lines of sight, they want to see where they're headed. Next slide. And an urban theorist, Kevin Lynch, in the image of the city, identified that people find their way, it's called psychogeography, you know, how we, in our minds, construct these inner maps of spaces. And in order to wayfind, we understand paths, edges, districts, nodes, and landmarks. We use those to orientate ourselves. So if you're trying to design a pleasurable journey, what you want to do, you don't just make a path, but you've got to interrupt that path with goals or events to design a journey for people so that you're not moving endlessly like down the barrel of a gun, down these long paths, to see that path is broken up by events, and we use those events to orientate ourselves. Okay, next slide, Patrick. Just a few visual examples. So this is one of my students' work. Really was just a long path, but you can see from the use of these two big green walls, psychologically that long path has been interspersed or broken up into a series of smaller outdoor rooms. Next slide. And in this image, this red element, whether it's a portal, an entrance, sometimes you could display artworks on it, you can sit on it, but here actually this red element actually leads you and leads you through the park. It's very, very obvious in its colour, you know, it's in opposition to the green around it. So you can even see it when you're elsewhere in the park. So you sort of like a spine running through the park. You can orientate yourself relative to it, but it leads you down a journey, but it breaks up that journey as well. Next slide. Okay, so we've done two ideas, maintenance, surveillance. The third idea is accessibility. And this is not only about, of course, clearly catering for access for everybody. That means ramps and clearly defined edges for vision impaired people. It's also this idea that spaces are safer if you attract not just one subculture, but the full spectrum of ages and cultures that you have in an area. And the reason for that is that if you just allow one subculture to dominate, they will feel like they will own it, and they, in the negative, it actually means that they might vandalise it because they feel that they can do whatever they want. In real terms, what this means is that people, CEPTD theorists, understand that if you have small children and old people, actually older people in a space, everybody somehow behaves, you know, with children. It's a very deep subconscious thing. With when there are children with their parents there, people feel that they've got to be a role model, and with older people there are their elders. So when you're designing spaces, you know, look, and it's also a thing that older people and people pushing prams have got a lower tolerance of unsafe spaces. So, you know, look at your sites and see, are there older people there? Are there families there? And ask yourself, you know, why aren't they there? And what can you put actually there for them? So in real terms, I think I've put that on the next slide, Patrick. It means, that's right, provide ramps, make the spaces easy to navigate, make sure that the wayfinding is well. Older people are vision impaired, so, you know, clearly define the edges, use tactile surfaces, use sound so that everybody, vision impaired people, can orientate themselves, because that's actually what you want, the full spectrum of ages to actually visit your site. Next slide, Patrick. And also, this comes from Jan Gel's book, which I recommend. It's very accessible. It's a pretty easy read about actually how to study public life. CEPTD theory says most of it has come from just observation, which is quite different to the designer saying, look, I know, go there, don't be arrogant, look at what's actually happening in your site, because we all have a tendency to think that we know, but we're actually just projecting our preconceived ideas. Actually have a look, you know, who's on your site, what are they doing and where are they doing it? So study the behaviour of people in your site. Next slide, Patrick. So The next theory is one of territoriality, and it came from a theorist called Oscar Newman, who studied in the 1970s the demolition. It was the very famous demolition of a very, very large housing development. I think it was in New York, Pruitt-Igoe, and it was massive and it was so dangerous it was demolished. And Oscar Newman asked himself, why was it demolished? And in fact, people say this was the end of modernism, when people really started to question why are modernist town planning principles and architecture so anti-human, not speaking to us. So largely the theory that he came up with was, and he looked at what really made this housing, so it comes from a study of housing, is that on the right there you've got two views of, they called them sky streets, and they were corridors. And on one side you had and anybody could walk along them, and so that's public space, and then you had your door to your apartment. So you've got completely public space hard up against completely private space. And what Oscar Newman said, that all of these developments failed because you've really got to have buffers between public and private, and also because there was no sense of ownership. Unlike a terrace house where you own your front garden, there's a sense of ownership of the space in front of your front door, and that sense of ownership then spills out onto the street. In these modernist developments, there were no interstitial spaces, so they failed. And what his theory, next slide, is about is that for people to feel comfortable in spaces, they have to feel an ownership over them, whether it's literal, I own my front yard, or whether it's at a neighbourhood scale and it's temporal, I feel my community owns this. You've got to feel some sort of ownership or connection. And the book that he wrote, Defensible Space, and then all the guides to creating defensible spaces, was actually about, is it a space or is it a place? Because you can't defend something that doesn't exist. And this was the problem with modernism. They had a whole lot of the sky streets and these open parks. There was no sense of ownership there because there was no demarcated territory to defend. So territoriality, maybe next slide, in practical terms, how you apply it is, here we go, no, back on to the next slide. I think I do that, here we go. You've got to ask yourself, does your space look and feel like a place? Because to be a territory, it has to feel like a place in the first instance. And so you've got to ask yourself, for this space to be a place, are public and private spaces demarcated? Do you know which is which? Does the space have edges and borders? Is it defined? And so if it doesn't, see, that's your design. Where's the edge of the space? What's its border? What's the entry condition? Does it feel like a precinct? Are the entry and exit points defined? And it's also a quality of a proportion. Does it feel like a room, not just a corridor or an over linear space? And you know that in your rooms, you'd never sit and have breakfast in the corridor. The proportion's wrong. You know, that long linear space makes you feel like you can't sit, like you should be moving, constantly moving. So just as an example, here we go, in this next project, City Lounge. So it was a downtown area, deserted at night time. And so the designers, to invigorate it, sought to add very different colour palette to the the grey of the city, but this idea of bringing elements of home. So what's comfortable to us to lounge, hence the word City Lounge. And so suddenly a territory was created, and it's created largely through, they didn't change the spaces, maybe the next slide, Patrick, through a visual language. And although this example here is architectural, you can see in this instance they've chosen a visual language that's complete contrast to the cold grey. You've got the very, very warm with very, very soft red. There's a contrast of visual languages, but through this visual language that's been applied to the site, you get a very, very clear idea of here is a territory, here is a precinct. So with your schemes, and it's very context dependent, whether you're in these smaller scale residential areas or whether you're in those working port areas, you've got to identify what visual language am I dealing with, and am I going to actually elaborate or enforce that visual language. So in the case of these red bricky areas, you work with those warm materials, or do you create an interesting opposition or conversation with opposing materials? And conversely, let's say in the port, we've got sort of a very, very large scale, these harder materials. What's my palette going to be? Is it going to be softening? And how do I create a precinct? Because what we're looking for here really is a visual coherence. To be a territory, visual coherence means that, you know, there's a patternation, there's an element that repeats, so that when I enter this territory, I know in all parts of this territory that there are elements that unite it. Okay, next slide, Patrick. So this is probably, in terms of CEPTD, I've gone from the simplest to the more complex and probably the richer and more important drivers. Territoriality and site activation are probably the large drivers for any CEPTD intervention or base scheme. So site activation means that you have to put something's got to be on the site that draws people to it. And it comes from a theorist, Jane Jacobs, in the 1960s, who just observed the brownstone New York, the pre-industrial New York that she lived in, and asked herself, why is this so delightful and so wonderful compared to modernist, sterile town plan spaces? And her famous saying is, you've got to have eyes on the street. When people say a city is safe, what they're actually saying is that there are people on the sidewalks, sidewalks being an American term, we say footpaths. So to have eyes on the street, you actually have to have a reason for people to be there. Next slide. So this is the opposite of what you find. The scale is inappropriate. It's a monoculture. Nobody's there. This comes from Jan Gehl, who famously said, nothing happens because nothing happens because nothing. You know, you have this downward spiral. If nobody's there, no one will go there. And if there is nobody there, nobody will go. Jan Gehl, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Jan Gehl in the next slide. In the 70s, after Jane Jacobs was achieving the same, people and particularly foot traffic. Jane Jacobs wanted eyes on the street, that's foot traffic, and that's quite different to people speeding past in a car. You know, there's a way that we interact when we're on foot. There's a way that is quite good that we potentially interact on a bicycle, but if you're in a car sealed up in your bubble, you don't interact at all. And so they were achieving similar aims to reinvigorate cities by creating this rich pedestrian life in the urban realm. And Jan said, oh, we can go again. Yes, you have to give people an invitation to be there. And here are, these are quite good. And I think, Patrick, I've given you a PDF. I won't read through this, but this is really quite a good summary of things that you should be looking at. This is from Jan Gell. Protection against traffic, opportunities to walk, opportunities to stand, opportunities to talk and listen. This little grid and the next one, it's all part of his little, do you delight people? Are they comfortable? Is all actually part of, you actually have to combat the dominance of the car, you have to invite people to inhabit, enter, and very importantly, linger in the city realm, in the civic realm. Next slide. So something as simple as seating, and he actually counted, if you give people more benches, how many people use the space suddenly doubles, and how much you invite them by giving them places to sit. And remember, I've also said that older people need places to sit and rest. That ticks the box of accessibility. So this thing of giving seating, making people comfortable, sheltering from them from the elements is all part of this invitation to stay, invitation to interact with your site. Next slide. And so when we say program, it doesn't necessarily, program means like a use. We use the word program normally in architecture for building uses. Here, I think in an urban landscape scheme, program has a more open, we can infer that it's more open. Here, it's quite nice if you think of adding structures that can be quite open-ended, meaning they can actually have multiple uses. And the kinds of things that we're talking about operate at the scale of what we call furnitecture. Is it furniture or is it architecture? It's not one or the other. And being such a small scale, they can be permanent, they could be temporary, or they could actually be quite ephemeral, just coming and going. They could be seasonal, they could be towed around the building, they could come for festivals, so on and so forth. And open-ended means that they could actually have a number of uses, which is quite a lovely thing because you're inviting the public to interact with them how they see fit. So both of these examples, one clearly is an interior, it's soft, one is exterior, are places to sit, particularly the purple one, that's very obviously a place to sit, whereas the timber one on the left is really interesting because you could sit there and feel sheltered and very safe looking out onto the elements, and conversely, you could have a band, a bunch of buskers, or some sort of a performance or a fashion parade occurring in these elements. And so it's much, much richer if you can invite people to interact with them in a spontaneous way. Next slide. More examples. These are obviously seating elements. What people like when they're seating is to have, and this comes from the studies called proxemics by, was it Alfred? Oh, I've forgotten his name. Alan T. Hall. The study of proxemics, that we feel comfortable seating in smaller spaces, looking out onto a larger space. So this thing of your back being covered is quite important, and this idea of breaking down a space by creating small cosy nooks actually within it. Next slide. Seating, particularly with the example on the right, can you see how these elements, we call this flexible furniture, that it doesn't have to be fixed, it can move. So if you encounter this element, it's either dividing a very, very large civic space into two, or you can pivot them so you can be seated by yourself, or you can face two of them so that those two people can interact. What's lovely about this is that people can interact with it and leave traces of their occupation actually on a space. Next slide. Look at all the street furniture, the bins, the bike parks, the bus stops. They're all opportunities for visual delight. We want to encourage bike use. Actually, to this, we can also add charging stations for electric bikes. That's a new, pretty groovy program as well. Next slide. Things like communal tables. And what's lovely about this is that you can choose to, the way that this large element, here it's an interior, but the same idea could apply to outside. You've got choice as to how you interact. You can choose your own little corner, or you can form a meeting. And this is what people actually like. It's called leaving the back door open. You don't enforce a certain way of inhabiting the site. You allow, it's quite open-ended. You allow people to interact as they want to on that particular day in that particular climate. Next slide. The idea of adding quite sculptural elements that might be quite open-ended. Is it a table? Is it a place where there's an outdoor market? Is it somewhere where a busker stands? Is it a chase lounge? Is it somewhere that you sleep? Is it a Wi-Fi zone? What is it? It's quite lovely to have elements that are multifunctioning. And they can, as you can see, multifunctioning means they can be quite sculptural. Next slide. Adding places where people can play sport is something quite lovely, and make it sculptural, make it fun, make it bright, make it something that people are drawn to. Next slide. More examples of very open-ended structures, and these close up at night time, so that people don't vandalise them, but they open up in the day or open up with that. And the one on the left is a sort of a kid's cubby kind of a thing, and the one on the right was meant to encourage people to do gardening. Anyway, look, you can see that a designer's having a lot of fun, but invite things that, invite the child in us to interact with them. Next slide. More of this, and whether it's an interior element, as is this, or with planting, creating cosy zones within a larger space. And what you can see here is that you would feel cosy, but can you see in CEPTD terms, there's complete, it's see-through. You haven't created a blind spot, you haven't blocked visual access, you can see through it, so you all feel safe, and yet that sub-zone has been demarcated. Next slide. Things like outdoor cinemas. They can be very ephemeral, you only need to have a pull-down screen, or there can be this little pavilion like this. But once again, it's open-ended. You can show a slide, show a movie at night time, but, in the pouring rain, somebody could actually sit in here and use it as a Wi-Fi zone. Here's another fold-out structure inserted into a park, and it's sort of a temporary library. So these are kind of ideas that your site, and in fact, studying the site and telling you who goes there, or more importantly, who doesn't go there, and you'll decide on some sort of a program that either supports its current occupation pattern or brings new people to it. So, you'll be inventive. But yes, be inventive, and also think laterally in terms of the kinds of programs that would delight people. So those are the main driving CEPTD ideas, but another theorist that I wanted to tell you about was Christopher Alexander. And this continues the theme of bringing elements of the pre-industrial city into modern spaces. What he did, and it's him and a number of co-authors wrote this very famous book in the 1970s called A Pattern Language. And what they looked at was a whole series of pre-industrial cities, villages, spaces. It's like a visual survey. And they identified what they called patterns. The whole book is patterns of things that delight humans from all cultures through time. So I'm going to just give you a few ideas from this book, because it's a very large book. This idea of positive outdoor space. So if we look at that village, what you'll notice is that the houses actually create these enclosed courtyards. He calls that positive space. And if we go to the next slide, I know it's a messy print screen. In blue, positive, these are spaces that are pre-industrial. They're defined. The street is defined. The edges are defined. When he speaks about negative space, what he's talking about is a modernist way of composing, whereby objects such as large office towers, large residential towers are plonked like spaceships. You can sort of see that with the circle on the left there. And this negative space, that's what you'll find in your ports. They weren't designed for people. It's a working port. These functional elements have been placed there, but it leaves space ill-defined, floating around them like a sea. So when dealing with particularly the working port areas, which are composed in this modernist way, next slide, what he says is that you need to fix them. You know, if you've got these floating objects, if you want people to feel comfortable around them, you've got to enclose spaces at a more appropriate scale around them, and then people will feel comfortable in those areas. So you're defining spaces and making smaller spaces. Next slide. And the next one, another pattern that's very important, are small public squares. And he calls these, a town needs public squares. They are the largest, most public rooms. And the book says that, you know, they want to be 14 by 18 metres, 21 metres maximum. And in this case, it doesn't have to be hard landscaping. They can be outdoor rooms created with planting. But it's this thing of a proportion and a certain size. Next slide. The next thing that he says, and I think this might be important for your side, is that cities need high places. So even in a flat landscape, once upon a time, a village would have had a church tower to climb. Because people need to see their landscape from above to make sense of it. Patrick sort of said that your site is very, very flat, and your visual access to the water has been blocked. And one way to create that connection might be either to cannibalise some old industrial piece of infrastructure, or to create something from which you can create this visual connection actually back to the water. And in CEPTD, that little diagram on the right in colour from Jan Gel's Cities for People, Jan Gel really encourages this overlooking, because surveillance is also important, that the buildings that look onto a square, that people have this visual connection to what's going on below. It makes what's going on in the square or the public space below much, much safer. So these high places have a dual function. There's a visual connection back to water, and there's increased surveillance on the public areas surrounding the high place. Next slide. Promenade is a pattern. So each subculture needs a centre for its public life, a place where you can go to see people and in turn be seen. And what a promenade needs, and I've used the example here, which you can probably Google, the St Kilda Promenade in Melbourne by Site Office. So like with wayfinding, this wooden promenade weaves along the foreshore, but it always has these events along it. It's broken up. And this is this idea with wayfinding, paths and goals. So the path has to be clearly defined, but you also have these goals. Oh, I'm going to walk along here until I get to the performance space. I'll walk along here until I get to the exhibition space. So this idea of a promenade works as it always classically has, with some sort of relationship with water. And the next pattern, next slide, access to water. We came from the water, our bodies are water, and water plays a fundamental role in our psychology. We need access to water. But everywhere in cities, water is out of reach. That's a problem of cities, many cities, unless they've addressed them. So yes, you'll have to work to instate that. But where you can't provide direct access to water, let's say the porter's working, you can, with a high place, create visual connections, or you can just celebrate the slide on the right in colour in a park. You can just celebrate this water in a more elemental way. You know, you might have the gutters collect water, it runs through this sculpture and then flows to the port. You know, this connection doesn't have to be direct. It's great if it is, and if you have a promenade there, but think of temporal ways, psychological connections to water, because it is important that we are actually connected to water. So that's Christopher Alexander, and I think we're near the end of the presentation. So my last, also something very important in CEPTD is lighting, because of course, just scroll down, Patrick, lighting, you know, it's at night time where people feel most unsafe because we don't have that surveillance occurring, or it's obscured. So lighting and how we light is very important. And what we prefer is to use lighting as a way, you know, to find your way. I think the image through the park there tells the story most. And because you're landscape architects, maybe scroll down again, you've got to actually be very, very aware of what people don't like in lighting. So this image here is very, very spooky. People intuitively don't like it. And the reason is that what you want to create is lighting that makes the ground plane very, very obvious so that you don't trip on that curb. The lighting level is too low. You can't see people's faces, and we want to read each other's faces, and it's not uniform. Lighting in public spaces has to be uniform, because if you've got this effect here, you have what's called a drop-off. There's areas that are brightly lit where your retina, your pupils actually contract, and then if you go outside of that brightly lit area, then they have to open up again. And in that moment of having to suddenly open up, you've got this moment of temporary blindness as your eyes adjust between dark and light. People don't like that. They like uniform light, and they prefer light not up high, but also where we are able to read each other's faces, and where wayfinding is clear. With lighting also, because we now all have LED lights, you know, because they're energy efficient, and everybody rushed into city. I think maybe it shows it in the next slide. Our old yellow sodium lights, which are more yellow, have been replaced by white LEDs. And LEDs can be tweaked to be any colour, and we don't want white. And the reason for that, next slide, Patrick, is this: we don't want to create light pollution. So in CEPTD terms, we prefer warmer colours, and it turns out that what's good for humans in this instance is also what's good for the natural environment. So light pollution is the fact that when we spray light, particularly in the cold colour temperature, so that's white, what looks like white has blue tones in it. So blue light, white light make any creatures, night creatures, insects, bats, insects, moths, think it's daylight, and we mess with their circadian rhythms. So the finding, when people have studied, it looks like an installation, but it's actually a study on what light is best for insects. And the finding is that red light is relatively okay with wildlife. So we're not going to put red lights necessarily everywhere, but what we do need to do is tweak LEDs to be of the warm spectrum, and to use it, instead of spraying light up into the night sky, we actually want it on the ground for wayfinding. So what's good for CEPTD is actually good for the circadian rhythm of the natural world. So I think, Patrick, we'll just flip over to that one example. All of these were, I've told you about theories, but actually in practice, I just wanted to show you these two examples of how does it all come together. So this project, Park and Play, Yaya Architects in Copenhagen, brings all of these ideas together. It's also in a port, of course. And so in terms of a visual language, you've got a visual language that is quite warm in contrast to the cold greys of the port. In terms of a site activation, so this was a dangerous car park and they built a playground. So it's this site activation, or bringing in a program that doesn't exist. So the visual language is in opposition to what's around it, and the whole colour palette, the warmth. So you've got Corten steel, you've got expanded mesh instead of bars. All warm colours create this precinct. There you can see the view. So very interesting with surveillance. What you can see is that the rooftop, maybe stick on, oh no, this next slide's good. That rooftop is designed, broken up into defined territories. So it's not just one big fat space that you would feel like an ant in. It's divided into a series of subzones. So they're all themed. It's all part of one precinct, but it's a more human scale is brought to the area. Here we go. There you can see it again. And next slide. And in terms of surveillance, I think keep going. Here you can see, even though there are a series of zones, you can see you've got visual access all the way through the site. And here you can see that these small seating subzones make people feel very, very comfortable, are also created within it. Also, what's important is that here we go. Yes, next slide. Keep going. Is the circulation actually on the outside? In your schemes, it's really important to have on the outside of buildings, because as you walk down here, you've got that very, very important surveillance actually down on the public spaces around it. You feel safe because everyone can see you. They feel safe because you're watching them. It's this visual connection between people on higher up levels and the ground plane. Here we go, sort of artwork, placing artwork on the stair so people can actually see it. That was a little bit about the port history, some idea of grounding people in the history of the site through this mural. A fantastic project that works on many, many levels. Here we go, much more beautiful car park interior, clear signage. And this project here in Florence, the pedibus, the idea was, instead of getting people to jump into their cars and drive children to school, we all hate that 9 o'clock and 3:30 traffic jam, is if we can get children, and the idea was that the pedibus, pedi meaning walking bus, to walk together to school, they would then feel safe. So I'll just scroll through until we've got a view of people. So studies were made, where are the schools, and routes were chosen connecting the schools, almost like a bus line. And what you do is you drop off your child and you sit with your child, maybe keep scrolling down to an image. Keep going, keep going. Yes, next one. Here we go. And you sit there, this mother is sitting there until her child's friend or some other children come, and then the children safely walk to their school. So this ticks the Jan Gell box of re-pedestrianising the city, encouraging walking, encouraging socialising, and it's achieved through, once again, this idea of a coherent and consistent language. These materials are hard-wearing, it's local stone, it's beautiful, spaces are tidied up. You might be doing things like this in the port. The black and white image on the left is parking as it is, and how it's cleaned up, that for the eye at ground level show care. Our eyes want to rest, not on ugly car parking and bins, you know, screen them, you know, provide these vertical screens. There we go, there's one photo. The next one is just a typical street. Keep going, Patrick. On the left is what was, bikes, bins, cars, ugliness, this visual editing and cleaning up, and this consistent language of stone making its way on the route of the bus. And I think that's it. So there we go, Patrick.
Amazing. Beautiful. Astrid, you've spoken for about at least an hour.
Oh, there we go. That's all right.
Are we back? We're all good?
We're all good.
While I've got you, I guess I thank you for that lecture. It's terrific. Wonderful examples, terrific points that you're making that are consistent throughout. With this site, something that's quite particular about it, and just picking up on some of the points you talked to then, whether you've got any insightful ideas, this idea of change in a very short period of time with this magical thing called sea level rise that this site is very vulnerable to. And certainly within a discussion with state government last week, they talked about this idea of 3 futures in the next 100 years. So it does lend, I think, in my mind, to an idea of thinking about movable structures or mobile structures, or universities that sort of long-term will put stone and things everywhere. But so I think some of these examples you're talking about could be really suitable.
No, I think that, so to have structures that move, and it might, something that could be fixed a little bit like flood markers, but in a poetic way, it would actually be quite lovely to demarcate different meter levels actually above current, you know, tide heights, you know, saying, well, it moves from here to here now, but it might move over here. So that you get also this kind of idea. This area is relatively stable, but this area could actually be subsumed. What does that mean? So I think as a designer, if you can make these natural processes evident, you've actually done something for the people who interact with the site.
Yeah, wonderful. Another sort of key issue I feel a lot of people in the studio are tussling with is public versus private space. And I guess I should say that as port-owned space and edges with massive ships coming up to versus public space. And part of that is about where does an ecology fit into that, and this sort of mangrove and a sort of softer edge versus a very hard, high turbulent water edge. And within the students, there's many people doing terrific kind of exploration around those sort of edge conditions. But I guess while I've got you, I'll ask.
I guess a response to that, whether it's is once again this idea of a visual language, that if you can kind of look at your site and assign a visual language of, this is the working area, it's this planting, it's this suite of materials, here is my intervention. People actually like to be able to read where they're allowed to go and not allowed to go. Does that make sense? That makes comfort. Yeah. Ambivalence, what territoriality is about is we don't want ambivalence. We want to know, this is my realm, this is not my realm. And so you might do something that you make the working areas look even more working, and where you've got an incursion where you bring people into working areas, with visual language, with planting, but you've got to be consistent. Wherever people are allowed, there's a particular visual language, there's particular hard landscaping responses, there's particular planting responses, so that you go, yes, this is my realm.
I belong
just
here.
Be very clear, because you're the one, as the designer on the site, you're the one actually setting up a conversation, really. But it's not just to leave the working areas. You might do that. The working areas might be allowed to be as cold, and you might actually play up on that. You might deliberately add stainless steel and really make it hard, some sort of an opposition. Or you might deliberately sabotage, subvert, and soften them. What is it? A plant bombing kind of event. Can you see? But in order to have a conversation, you have to know what side you're on, and you have to make the people that you're designing know where they're standing. Are you encouraging? Is it some guerrilla occupation? Is it a very, very proud occupation that you sort of come in? Is it oppositional? Is it sneaky? The idea of sneaking. And if you can't take over the waterfront, maybe through high places and a more psychological bringing of that water. Nothing stops you taking that water and piping that water actually into the town square, and having a pool that rises and falls with the tides. You can play games there.
Certainly seen that idea starting to get touched into on students' work, which is great. And you talked about, I thought, which was really relevant in that park and play and that scale building, but there's certainly extremely large scale buildings, industrial buildings, being used currently with massive ships coming in on the edges, and this blocking of the waters visual to this very flat in a sort of flat island of odd suburbia. So I think I feel like you're giving some real clues as to how people can begin to approach making these connections, either by going up, or whether people could look at going up on top of some of these buildings a bit more, or what's possible.
And it could be, and you're always looking for excuses to go up, because of course going up costs more money than just being at ground level. But if you're saying, okay, it's a boardwalk, I'm avoiding mangroves, and oh gosh, but then it suddenly kicks up, and oh look, you do look down into the working port, don't you? You've always got to argue for raised structures because they do cost more. But having said that, these high places and this ability to make these connections, these visual connections to the water, they're very important. And what buildings can you cannibalise? You might not be allowed in the working port, but can there be some high walkway through it? That's glass enclosed or caged, so that you're in it but not in it.
There was a similar project that came up last year that comes to mind, and it got criticism for a high raised bike path thing, and the criticism being the lack of neighbourly connection. It sort of rose up and then continued as a continuous piece. So I feel if anyone wants to explore that, there's got to be conversations around how it knits back into the very local block structures of what's underneath.
But you see, this is that thing. It's very context dependent, because in CEPTD terms, those residential areas with the beautiful warm brick, which weathers well, that connection to history, it's inviting a more subtle response because there's already a lot there that works that you're knitting in with. So any sort of strategy for moving through those areas is quite different to then in the port, where you then suddenly have a leap in scale. So it's just one of these things of know what context you're dealing with. And let's say in the case of a walkway, your strategy for how it knits with the low-rise Victorian brick residential and how it interacts with the working port, that same element, will have to do quite different things. One's a quiet conversation and one might have to be shouting.
Yeah.
But the same element has to do both, actually.
Yeah. I suddenly wish this was a very live in-class lecture, and I wish we had 5 people in the room to ask you questions, because I'm sure everyone would have slightly different ones. But that's all I can think of in a sort of quick, brief way that might be crossing various projects that the people have got up their mind. Astrid, thank you.
Thank you.
That was terrific.
Okay, and I'll probably.
I look forward to us all
some
discussing this.
Come assessment time.
Brilliant. We would love to see you at assessment time. Get it in your diary. Last day of November, first day of December. I'll follow you up on that.
All righty.
That's brilliant. Okay. Bye.
Okay. Bye.